of kind of like my intent with this is that it's a big experiment. Sometimes I'm a risk taker. I like to try things. And so I'm hoping that this is a very informative series of webinars that we do over the course of time, but hopefully a little bit less formal than like talks. But that's kind of a process to see how we kind of develop this. But a lot of it, of the intention of the series too, is to be looking at what are some innovations going on in mentoring. What's kind of like the latest research about what works. So I'm a very practical person. I really want to focus on like, what really helps change the lives of young people. And actually shouldn't even just say young people, but also mentors and other people as well too. But I tend to be a very practical person, and I want this series to kind of reflect that as well too. Like, what are things that are actionable that we kind of begin to put into the field in North Carolina in particular? And so if folks are not terribly familiar with Mentor North Carolina, we have a couple of core things that we're focused on. We really help other mentoring organizations in terms of a couple of things: increasing the number of mentoring relationships, increasing the quality of those relationships, and also on racial equity. It's very central to our mission and focus, and has been from the beginning. And just so people know, and I'll mention this again later, one of the great benefits of Mentor North Carolina is we offer free technical assistance to mentoring organizations, and you can always contact me about the details about that later. So a little bit about me. I started my career actually as like a school social worker and what we call a graduation coach within communities and schools, and then went into program management, and then eventually was the CEO of two different nonprofits, Communities and Schools and Prevent Child Abuse North Carolina, an education technology startup company to help more college students get through college, particularly first generation college students. And I've been involved in about 8 different research projects in all kinds of different ways, from staff to consultant and kind of co-investigator kinds of things. So I love the world of research, but my role is like, I never wanted to be a Sarah. My niche was always like, how do we get research out of the world of academia into the world of practice? But also, how do we inform research from the world of practice? It's kind of, my perspective is a dialogue and a back and forth. And so that's also a little bit of the background on this kind of series that we're doing as well too. A couple of housekeeping things. What we'll do is, if people have questions that they want to kind of answer, we'll probably have most of the questions towards the end. But if something seems very relevant, I may jump in and interrupt Sarah, hopefully in a gentle and kind of way. So post those questions in the chat section as you're going along, and I'll be particularly focused on like picking up those and kind of chronicling those so that we can address those elements of it. And I'm trying to think if I think that's it for the moment. Yeah. So Sarah, a couple of just background things on Sarah that people should know. And Sarah, you're going to have to correct me and fill in some of the gaps too. So Sarah's, a lot of her research interest is around adolescence, the transition to adulthood, positive youth development, working with marginalized populations, these kinds of networks of support. And some of that comes out of your background, kind of how your career has evolved as well too. And I'm kind of actually curious, if I turn it over to you, if you'd first say a little bit more about, I think, some of your background, because I think it says a lot about like why you're doing the kind of research that you're doing. And I almost think it may just transition into your talk then.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bud. And thank you for having me. Thank you all for taking time in busy lives and a busy world right now to join us. To answer your question, Bud, I think so before I went into research, I was a middle school and high school English teacher in Boston and New York public schools, and really saw firsthand the need for mentoring relationships and social emotional support and I think, as much as I think the 5-paragraph essay is extremely important, that it felt really hard for me to be focusing on that when I was working in high poverty, high trauma schools, and it felt like there were so many more pressing issues. So went on to get a doctorate in clinical psychology, but really, so I'm a licensed therapist and primarily focused on adolescents, but really my interest is around school and community-based interventions and how we can really take what we know supports young people in formal helping settings and bring them to informal helping settings. And we know that the vast majority of young people aren't going to go to a therapist's office, but still have a lot of need, and that all of us have a need for support. And really, again, I studied with Jean Rhodes, and she's my mentor. She was and still is my mentor, and focused on mentoring relationships, and then really moved from the focus on a one-on-one mentoring relationship to really thinking about circles of support, and the need not just to have a single peer mentor, but thinking about how we can really empower young people to recruit support from a range of people. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And again, yeah, go ahead.
And I wanted to say that's exactly what I wanted to bring you on for, was that I've been aware of youth-initiated mentoring for a few years just because of some other work that I had been doing. But I think it's a great way. It's an alternative model that's kind of forward-thinking. And actually, I think in some ways, it's very, I have this thing I call the duh factor in research. Sometimes someone names something in research and it's like, well, duh, of course that's like true. But sometimes it takes the research to kind of name it or rename it and all. And since I have a lot of background in the mental health side and I'm biased towards, it's this, all these different skills that young people need to succeed, not in addition to the normal academic ones that we think a lot about. And so that's one of the reasons I was like super excited about you. And so like, yeah, tell us a little bit more about youth initiative mentoring and networks of support, and it's yours.
I'm excited to, and I just want to say, I know, but you talked about really that your passion is being at this place of translating research and practice and bringing together the two forms of expertise. And you're speaking my language. I think, as I said, but I so much prefer giving talks and having discussions with practitioners than fellow researchers, because the research means nothing without the practice side. And so again, feel free to stop me, share your own stories, ideas, feedback, because again, you're the ones who really understand how some of these models and ideas could work in a program. So I would love this to be a dialogue. I know that it's always a little harder on Zoom, so I may go into my giving my talk mode, but please stop me. Feel free to add questions to the chat box. I'm pretty terrible at multitasking, but I think Bud will help me in translating questions if I can't keep up. And again, as much as possible, I'd love to hear your thoughts and ideas as well. I'm just going to share screen. Okay, so this talk really is about how mentoring programs can help youth build webs of support. And so I'll be talking a little bit about just my frame of webs of support. I'll be talking briefly about youth-initiated mentoring, but I can say more about it if there are questions. Then I'll be talking about this approach to skill building, an intervention that we called Connected Scholars, and talking a little bit about this idea of network engaged mentoring. So how formal mentoring programs that maybe use a more traditional volunteer mentoring model can still be working with young people to cultivate networks of support. But also feel free to help me with time if I need to speed up, because time management is not my forte. So this is a model from a fellow researcher, Shannon Varga, who talks about this model again of webs of support. And I just wanted to start with this because, again, I think for too long, mentoring programs have been focused primarily on that one-to-one mentoring relationship, which obviously is extremely important, but sometimes we've been looking at it with blinders and forgetting that there's a lot of other people in young people's lives, and that most of us need a web of support rather than a single one-on-one mentoring relationship. So as Bud already referenced, I'll be talking about this kind of new model of mentoring. And I think when I entered the mentoring field, it felt like there were people particularly in the research field, those who focused on formal mentoring interventions and formal mentoring programs, and then those who study natural mentoring relationships being those that just form organically between youth and adults in their communities, and formal mentoring being when a program comes in and assigns a mentoring relationship. And there was really the sense that there wasn't anything in between, and that formal mentoring was where we could do interventions, and natural really nothing we could do about it. But I think again, this talk will be about the space in between. And I came at this through the lens of youth-initiated mentoring, and that's actually what I conducted my dissertation on. And youth-initiated mentoring is a really hybrid model where young people are, with support, recruit someone from their existing social network to become their formal mentor. So then the program will still provide something that looks in some ways like traditional mentoring. They'll screen the recruited mentor, they'll provide training and support, and they'll provide recommendations about meeting regularly, and monitoring of that relationship. And again, in some ways, I think what's exciting about it is that it's drawing on these natural systems of support, and rather than this model where you need to bring someone in from an outside community, which I think the dangerous part of that model is even though, again, many programs don't do it this way and work very hard to make sure their mentors aren't perceiving it this way, that it can positive people in that young person's life, and we need to bring someone positive in from the outside, and that's just not true. And I think that's really a dangerous assumption. And so I think youth-initiated mentoring really acknowledges strengths of the community and thinking about how we can bolster and support those strengths. And this was a model that is used particularly among adolescents. And I think it's also really important empowering particularly adolescents to say, who is in your life, it's hard to build trust with an adolescent. I am a therapist to adolescents. It takes a little while to build those relationships. And when you empower them and give them the autonomy to select someone, then that can be really powerful in the relationship building process. So, and then I think the other piece that to me was really exciting about youth-initiated mentoring, and again, feel free to stop me if you want me to say more about about youth-initiated mentoring itself. But I would say the other thing that got me really excited about it was the idea or the question whether we can teach young people to identify and recruit mentors in their lives, right? So that piece of how do you support and train a young person to look at their social network and think about, is there anyone in my life who could provide support to me? And who are the people who help me be my best self? And most adolescents, if you start and say, you need to recruit a mentor who's a mentor in your life, most of them will say, I don't know, I don't have a mentor. But then with support, then most of them really can identify someone. So how do we, what's going on in that intervention itself? And that for me was really what brought me to the idea of whether there are things that we can do in terms of providing skills training and knowledge to help young people recruit natural mentors, real with or without a formalized mentoring program. And so again, I think in the interest of time, I may not turn this into a full discussion to save time for conversation. Again, I have trouble keeping up with chats and and talking at the same time, but would love to have you share with each other, and I can try to catch up as well, really thinking about where your services lie on this continuum of natural to formal mentoring relationships. Again, are you really primarily formal? Are you formal, but wanting to start to think about how can we cultivate the skill set? Are you doing youth-initiated mentoring? Yeah, so it would be great to hear a little bit about that, at least in the chat room.
Yeah, so if people want to put that in the chat, that would be great.
Thank you. But I think then I will, in the interest of time, keep moving forward so we can have time for Q&A at the end. So again, this really led me to this question of, can we help young people become what we sometimes call mentor magnets? Though, because again, the analogy we often use is, if you teach someone, or if you give someone a fish, they will fish for a day. If you teach someone to fish, they will eat for a lifetime. And so how can we teach young people to fish for mentors, to use my metaphor perhaps a little too far? So this led to the development of an intervention that we called Connected Scholars, which really moved from being a mentoring intervention to what we called a social capital intervention, with the idea of social capital being the resources and support that relationships bring with them. So, having more support can help you, emotionally, but it also can open a lot of doors in terms of internships, in terms of information to help teach you how to apply to college, things like that. And so this was actually an intervention that we developed in the context of a TRIO program in Boston, supporting high school students from first generation college bound students, and students of color and low-income students to go to college. And basically what they said, which is true for a lot of programs, is we're really good at getting our students into college, but we aren't good at supporting them once they're there. They lose us, which was their support system kind of through the 4 years of high school. They lose us and they never rebuild that support system. And that's really, research supports that as well. So this intervention was really thinking about how can we teach that skill set so that then when they go to college, they can recruit a support system. So that's kind of the background of where this came from. So we piloted this program, and then we had a model of change. And I should say this model of change comes from a later version that was directed at college students, but I think there's a lot of overlap, and this is a model of change that was developed with Jean Rhodes, Janice Cooper-Schmidt, and Stella Conchewa, who worked on the Connected Scholars intervention with me. So the idea was we can develop this intervention, or basically set of workshops, that cultivates a specific knowledge set about the importance of mentoring, social capital, social support. What are your available resources, help recruiting skills, attitudes towards help seeking, network orientation, self-advocacy. Then that would lead to both maintaining support systems and developing new support systems in college, which then would lead to better psychological functioning, academic engagement, and academic outcomes. So what does this look like? This was our original workshop model that we developed, again, with this high school program. What is a mentor, and how can mentors help me? Who are the adults or potential sources of support in my life? How do I identify and recruit mentors? How do I cultivate and maintain mentoring relationships? How do I overcome challenges related to networking and mentoring? How do I build mentoring relationships in college? How do I build my social network and become a mentor magnet? And and at the end, we did actually a networking event where we had students really practice, giving their elevator spiel, and did some speed mentoring, speed networking, where they would need to introduce themselves to a set of people who both they had recruited and professionals that we recruited. And so these are a couple of quotes from the first study we did. Again, this was in 2016. And this was one of the students who said, "I always used to be the guy who just sits around because I didn't like approaching people. So now I'm like, I should go for it, because you're always going to need somebody there to help you, somebody by your side, somebody who has your back." And I think one of the pieces that really was notable for us was watching a lot of these young people switch from this idea of, it's weak to need other people, to really, of course we all need people, and even if I don't need anyone right now, I should be cultivating these relationships because I might need them later. And then another young woman we interviewed who was in the intervention said, I didn't know you can just ask a person if they know someone that's kind of related to something you want to do. And she was talking about she wanted to be a pediatrician, but said, I don't know any doctors. And then to her, it was like a light bulb went off when it was, you can ask your teachers at school, do they know any doctors you can connect with? So that idea of networking, which again, sometimes if nobody tells you about, how would you know that you can do that?
And Sarah, I want to go back to, I think it's really important. One of the things that you said is that a lot of young people think it appears to be weak to ask for help. So I think that's really cool that you're building that into the intervention to kind of normalize that. Not only is it not weak, it's actually, this is a skill that helps you get ahead. It's like the opposite. Like you actually want to develop this. I probably have been guilty of this a whole lot of my life, but I think I've heard a lot from students from marginalized populations that particularly if they're going into college, they feel that even more so, that they feel like, no, like other people seem to be doing it on their own. If I'm asking for help, that means like I don't really belong in this setting, or it sends that kind of message, or that's their fear.
Exactly. Yeah. And research really does support that, that, there's, that the idea of asking for help, particularly if you already feel like, universities weren't designed for people like me. And there's already this fear of, do I fit in? Will people see that I don't belong? And then the idea of asking for help feels like it could out you, rather than this is what everyone's doing and everyone here needs help. And actually, when I was presenting this intervention, there was a professor at a university in Boston who shared this kind of heart-wrenching story about, she was someone who would bend over backwards to support her students and make sure that they were successful. But she shared a story of hearing from someone who worked at the cafeteria at her university that this cafeteria worker's son had dropped out of college at that university because he had gotten a bad grade in her class. And he never said anything. And she, if he had approached her, she would have done a lot to support him in it, but she just never knew. Whereas, she had other students like knocking down her door when they got a B, and or just failing an exam, and then she worked with them, and then they were able to work their way up. So that piece of being willing to ask for help, I think, is crucial, again, particularly for populations traditionally marginalized and oppressed and historically underrepresented in college education. So then we also, let's see, I'm gonna, I think, go quickly through this, but we did a condensed version of this, which was only 4 one-hour workshops, and we did this in a college bridge program. And what we found was that students who participated in this 4-hour intervention participating in the college bridge program without the 4-hour intervention, that so that's feeling like it's helpful to have a network, the value of a network. Their help-seeking avoidance decreased. They reported greater intention to seek support and to engage in networking. They had better relationships with instructors, and they actually also had higher GPAs, which again, I think speaks to this piece of asking for help when you're struggling in college or in a class. So coming back to thinking about kind of what more traditional mentoring programs can do to engage in this kind of web building and supporting young people in recruiting support. So the Center for Promise at BU, which is run by, among others, Jonathan Zaff and Shannon Varga, use the analogy of anchors and webs, which I think is really helpful. And they talk about how mentors can serve as anchors that then connect youth to webs of support. And they have this really nice quote students could be standing in a room full of support, but they need someone to turn on the lights so they can see what's there and reach for it. And I think this is important because, again, it's not either or, like either we do formal one-on-one volunteer mentoring or we focus on the web of support. That actually that mentor, if they're oriented to this web of support mentality, can really play a powerful role in helping the young person connect with others in their lives. But I think it's important for us as mentoring programs to orient them to that. So they're not thinking, I'm the only person in this young person's life and it's my job to save them, or the only focus is my relationship with them, but really part of my job is to help them build other connections. So this is actually a recent study, an article that just came out from that was actually using the mentoring enhancement demonstration project data, which was led by Roger Georgiora, and one of my doc students, Laura Austin, led this study. But basically, she was looking at the behaviors that mentors engaged in formal mentoring programs and community-based mentoring, and looking at particularly their connections with their mentee, as well as whether they engaged in what we called connecting or mediating or advocating behaviors. So how much were they introducing their mentee to other people? How much were they advocating or mediating conflicts with other adults in the mentee's life? How much were they really actively trying to connect their mentee with other people and engage with other adults in the mentee's life? And what we saw is mentors who were in this close connectors group were far more effective at to the youth becoming more connected. So youth who had close connector mentors had improved parent-child relationship. They engaged in more extracurriculars. They actually started out engaging in fewer extracurricular activities than the other groups and ended up surpassing them because the mentor was actively helping them connect to different groups. And they increased in their help seeking, in their self-reported help seeking skills. So we're more likely to ask for help. So I think this is a nice model of, again, even in a traditional mentoring program, that when mentors are engaging in these behaviors, that then their mentees leave the mentoring relationship really better equipped to engage with natural mentors and other adults in their lives. Because again, most formal mentoring programs, the expectation isn't that the formal mentoring relationship will last forever. So how can we make sure that when we leave, the mentee still has a network of support?
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting, I hadn't thought about that. I think from before, with my familiarity with like your work, was like you can train mentors and coach them to play this role. And going back to your original logic model, what are the belief, skills, and attitudes that you'd want to cultivate in the mentors so that they have the confidence that they could do this and that it's a useful thing to be teaching the young people in a skill set or benefit that they have. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, even thinking about combining traditional mentoring with youth-initiated mentoring, how can part of the closure ritual for a formal mentoring relationship be the young person identifying, when I'm no longer meeting with you, these are the people who I could reach out to, or these are my natural mentors, or how could we even take content from the Connected Scholars workshops and embed it in some of the activities that mentors are doing with their mentees. So let me know if you're interested in trying and or collecting data on some of those things. One other piece of research that I just wanted to mention, I'm going to check time, okay, is some research conducted by a researcher named Dixie Ching, which is about the importance of brokering. So that this was looking at after school programs more generally, not specifically mentoring, but really was focusing on not being just a blip in someone's life. That the problem is with a lot of research on mentoring relationships and most after school programs is while the youth is in that program, outcomes improve. And then as soon as they're no longer in the program, then the outcomes erode pretty quickly. And what they're finding is that when folks in the program can engage in effective brokering, so connecting youth with other organizations that that either they're doing alongside or can transition to when this program ends, that then you see the outcomes lasting a lot longer. And again, obviously this takes time and effort and resources, and part of the reason why programs, they don't engage program forever is because you have a new cohort coming in. But I think just having this on the radar of, what are the ways that we're supporting alumni of our program, I think is an important question. So to wrap up my portion, before we move into Q&A, I wanted to just kind of come back to the Venn diagram and think about how we can expand our approach to mentoring. So, I started out with youth-initiated mentoring. I also just want to mention a couple other models that I think really are in this hybrid model area. So Tim Cavell and Lindsay Weiler are developing a model they call caregiver-initiated mentoring, which is basically thinking about, for younger kids, would there be ways to empower their caregivers to reach out and recruit natural mentors for them? Because youth-initiated mentoring really doesn't make sense for an elementary school kid, and it's designed more for older populations. So youth-initiated, caregiver-initiated, is connected scholars or just mentee training more generally type interventions, which are more on the side of natural mentoring. Everyday mentoring is also a model that's being conducted by the Pittsburgh Mentoring Partnership, where they're basically training adults who spend time around kids and how to take advantage of those mentoring moments, and they call them everyday mentors. Network engaged mentoring, which might be more on the side of formal mentoring relationships, but how can we take formal mentoring and just use it to expand natural mentoring relationships? So those are just a few possibilities. I think that there's many more models that we could throw into this diagram, and I'm sure that all of you have a lot of ideas. So I wanted to transition into, again, either discussion or Q&A. Some of the questions that I was interested in was how we can help our mentees cultivate webs of support, what you're already doing, what more could you be doing, how these models are not relevant to your programs, what would be some potential obstacles or benefits, or really anything else that you'd like to throw at us.
Well, first, Sarah, thank you. And that was incredibly a fast synopsis. My guess is that you probably don't have to be that concise in some other settings that you present about your research and everything. So appreciate it. But I also really appreciate, like I said, like it's a different angle and it's practical. And, in one of our primary areas of socializing youth is particularly the education world, which really tends to, in my opinion, overemphasize academically oriented skills with long-term and a bunch of other skills that we don't emphasize very much, including like who matters as much. I don't know the numbers or the effect size or whatever, as like what so and developing those skills over time is really interesting. So let me give you a couple of the questions, and actually some of these I can also respond to too. But if you have other questions, like putting them up into the chat box is a perfect place to do it. So we had one question about if youth are cultivating, or young adults are kind of cultivating some of their own relationships, how do they screen these potential mentors themselves in terms of safety issues and stuff? Sarah, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question that usually comes up with youth-initiated mentoring. And I would say there's a couple of different responses. So most programs in the US that do youth-initiated mentoring still do their typical screening process. So the screening actually would be pretty much identical to how you would screen any volunteer mentor. I would say, again, there's pushback against that, both in the United States, and there's actually a lot of youth-initiated mentoring happening in the Netherlands right now. And in their model, they don't do background checks, and they really emphasize, that if this is who the youth is choosing, and if we're doing this youth empowered model, then we need to respect their choices. And I think they try to have a support system to not have the young person in a dangerous situation. But if there's a previous record, they wouldn't necessarily say, and therefore you can't be a mentor. And there, I would say, even in the U.S. is pushback against at least holding background checks and because you do lose a lot of certain populations. But again, I would say more generally, one answer is just do the same screening process as you would always do, because it's and let the young people know from upfront that these are what we're going to be screening mentors on, so that they're not set up for disappointment of like, this is my perfect mentor, and then they don't pass the screening. But I think that does sometimes happen, which is challenging. And I think the other piece of my response would just be that process of working with the young person and caregivers to identify a mentor is crucial. So again, that it's not just, you write down the name of a person and we'll go find them. It's let's really think about who are the different people in your life. What do you want in a mentor? Who brings out the best in you? Who doesn't always bring out the best in you? And what would it be like to have this person be your mentor? So you're really supporting them through that process and helping them, again, be set up for success and not pick someone who you're like, this is not someone who I want to be their mentor, or my program can't in good conscience match you with this person. But it gets complicated, especially if you have one preference from the caregiver and one preference from the youth, and then you have the program concerns. That stage is a messy stage.
And it's one of the things that we work with, even just in terms of more traditional mentoring programs, of telling them that to complement the formal background checks in terms of safety, and also the other part of that is like the match is like the suitability is do they seem to be like how suitable do they seem to be to the program, is to tell program staff, like, trust your gut too as you're going through, as you're interviewing staff. And I could imagine, that's a more informal process, but also teaching young people that sense of, if your gut is saying this is not a good person for you, like in your life or whatever, that something's just off, trust that, respect your intuition around that as well too.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I think, outside of mentoring programs, there are programs that really focus on training young people to, identify potential sexual predators, both online and in person. So I think potentially in these types of models, it could be interesting to draw in some of those trainings that are less often used in mentoring context, because, the onus is much more on the program, but drawing in some of those trainings. And then I know the SAFE training is used a lot, I think, or the SAFE screening in mentoring programs, which really goes beyond a background check, and is, I think, one of the most evidence-based training or screening practices there is.
And there was another related question to that of like, for programs, is they're doing it with the mentors that they're kind of bringing into the networks. This is about a private virtual network. What are other things they can use other than just the FBI background check? And I don't know if this is what was intended by the question, but sometimes I associate the FBI background check as like a fingerprint based check. And there's a number of online other screening tools that you can use, some of which are for free. Sometimes they're state oriented, sometimes they're national oriented. But that's not the only level of background check that you can use or even should be using. You should really be using multiple sources as well too. All right, another question is, what kinds of work have you or others done in terms of the mentor training and development? Thoughts on who else has done training and for the training of mentors in particular is what they're talking about here.
Yeah, so I think Jean Rhodes and Janice Cooper-Schmidt, Bud, you probably know more about this than I do, have an evidence-based mentor training program that can be conducted both virtually and in person, which I think is one of the primary evidence-based mentor training programs. Again, my research is really focused more on the mentee side in some ways, because it felt like most mentoring programs and mentoring research focused on the mentor training side, and wasn't really thinking about what the mentees brought to the relationship. So that's where I focused more. The other thing, I guess, or the other source that maybe is a little more related to some of what I've been talking about, is this mentoring enhancement demonstration research project, which was run by a lot of the, I guess, again, Roger Georgiora, Tom Keller, David Dubois, Carla Herrera, which was really thinking about, are there practice enhancements that can increase the effectiveness of mentoring? So thinking about, how can we teach mentors to engage in more advocacy or more skill-based teaching to mentees? And I don't know if that's been translated yet into like training manuals and materials, but I think that's an intention. Yeah, I'm excited to see what comes out of that.
Yeah. So just to go back in terms of the program that Sarah mentioned before that Janice Cooperschmidt and Gene Rhodes did, that's all available at mentoringcentral.net. I'll try to take a moment to post that in the chat box, but it's mentoringcentral.net, where there, particularly like there's online trainings that you can purchase. And at least at the time, it was the only evidence-based training that was available. Don't know if that's still true or not. Okay, another question. What would be a good approach to develop student interest, and this is particularly college students, interest in being mentors? So this was more oriented towards, like, I think a program that sounded like it was pure mentoring oriented, but kind of blurred into like this youth-initiated mentoring. So it sounds to me like, the self-efficacy of the confidence, like what are some of the things that could be done that would give like college students, I think, the confidence to feel like, yeah, I can do this.
Yeah, no, I think I actually just last week was running a training for graduate peer mentors across STEM graduate schools at Harvard. And one of the things that we were really emphasizing was thinking about, again, kind of different roles and what's the role of the peer mentor. And I think that can be helpful, particularly for peer mentors, where it can feel really overwhelming of, there's so many different issues coming up, and how can I manage all of that? And really thinking about, for peer mentors, that they should never be the only person who's the support person in the mentee's life, and that they're one of multiple touch points, but often are kind of the first line of support, right? They'll often hear about things before others do. So again, I mean, this is probably my orientation speaking, but really having the peer mentors think about their roles as connectors. So it's not just, oh, I need to solve my mentee's problem, but how can I help connect my mentee and engage in soft handoffs, or give them the efficacy to ask for help from other folks who might be better situated to solve the problem. So really thinking about providing some of that social emotional support and some of that connecting and informational support, again, rather than needing to be the primary problem solver. Yep. That's one piece. I can say more about that, but.
So this is a very timely question. So someone brought up the issue of like, what are the pros and cons or potential benefits and downsides? Kind of in the current situation, there's a lot of virtual mentoring going on, but if you kind of are blending virtual mentoring with youth-initiated mentoring, what are some of the potential like novel things that could add, as well as what are some of the potential downsides of like doing it in the way that most programs are kind of forced to be doing it right now?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'll get to virtual and youth-initiated mentoring in a moment. One place I wanted to start with was actually thinking about kind of connected scholars and virtual, because I think that in some ways there's Connected Scholars type interventions can be a nice fit for virtual and these just socially disconnected times. Because I think one of the things that we found most in that intervention is we had a lot of assignments, which was like, go interview someone about their mentoring relationships, or go interview someone who's related to some sort of job you might be interested in and ask them about their story, and we give them prompts. And basically it gave them an excuse to reach out to people, particularly for, adolescents and emerging adults, because they would say, I've been told that I need to do an interview, and then get to really have a lovely conversation and a connecting conversation with someone who they otherwise wouldn't reach out to. And so I think especially right now where people are just so disconnected, and it's so, especially thinking of kind of high school and college contexts that are doing virtual learning, that you don't have those casual conversations, or those, I'm just going to stay after class and talk to you. And you're not going to necessarily email your teacher and say, oh, can you set up a Zoom call with me? So I think it can be a really nice way to give young people an excuse to reach out and have a conversation with someone who they might be wanting to have a conversation with. And actually Jean Rhodes developed an app that basically has interview prompt questions, drawing from some of the interviews that we've done in Connected Scholars, so students can use that app to conduct these interviews, which again, I think is just a nice virtual way of doing some of this. In terms of youth-initiated mentoring and virtual, I think it has a lot of the pros and cons of, I think, traditional mentoring as well. But I think already youth-initiated mentoring can feel a little bit more like outside of the hands of the program, of, that relationship. They already have a relationship outside of the program. So, it's a little harder to monitor and have that relationship kind of follow the expectations of the program. And I think that's a little bit more true in virtual mentoring as well. So I think that can feel challenging. I think that said, also, I know some programs doing virtual mentoring are having all of the communication on their own virtual platform. So that actually, on the flip side, gives the program a lot more oversight of what's happening in that relationship as needed. But again, I think that it's a little harder to make the youth-initiated mentoring relationship fit exactly into the model of what the program wants it to be. So that can be challenging in these virtual contexts.
Great. There's also kind of a question in here about, do you know of supports for parents to support mentoring with their children?
So I would say, so one answer is this new model of caregiver initiated mentoring, which really the model, which again, Lindsay Weiler and Tim Cabell are leading, where really the model is how can we help caregivers to reach out to other adults in their lives to help them become natural mentors to their kids. Then also Renee Spencer has done a lot of great research on the importance of the parent or caregiver relationship in the dyad, and that again often the focus is on mentor-mentee, but that the caregiver's relationship with the mentor makes a huge difference, which I'm sure everyone who's in mentoring knows, but I think the research needed to catch up to a little bit. And I think some important research that also has come out both from Renee's lab and others is the risk of, even when mentors try to make sure that they have a really positive strength-based view of the youth, that they don't always extend that to the caregiver, and that is harmful to both the youth and the caregiver and the relationship. So that it's really important to think not just about how we're training mentors to interact with youth, but really how we're training them to interact with the families, and I guess not only interact, but really the attitudes and orientation towards the family, and making sure that strength-based model is coming through in all places.
Yep. So I want to make sure that we leave some time here. I'm going to bring like my very practical side, which is like, okay, great. I'm all excited about all this kind of stuff. Like, what can I do tomorrow? Like, not waiting for like some researcher to manualize and then somehow sell in some obtuse kind of way. Um, but I want to point out a couple of things that have already come up. So we did talk about the online mentor training at mentoringcentral.net, and that link is in the list. One of my old colleagues, actually Rebecca, also on the chat, posted that there's the Connected Scholars program. That one version of the curriculum is there, and that's particularly was oriented towards that transition to college aspect of it. I want to
Yeah,
kind
it
of
actually has been developed into a 1 credit course for college students as well. But I think also there's versions that are focused on more of that transitioning age. And thank you, hi Rebecca, and thank you for putting that in the chat room. I probably should have included that link in the talk.
What about, are there, okay, so those are a couple of things and a couple of links. And when we send out the notes to this, what I'll do is I'll try to add some of these links so that they come in the follow-up email so people can kind of get to them right away. Are there other things that if people are excited about youth initiated mentoring or something related to it that you're like here's some other links that like you could jump onto like tomorrow or this afternoon um, to start like looking into how they can actually do this more?
Yeah, so one thing is feel free to shoot me an email and I can send some resources. For youth initiated mentoring, Mike Garinger has developed a lot of really great resources around youth initiated mentoring. I know the National Mentoring Partnership also has a webinar that's online that I think has some really helpful practical information about setting up a program, which I talk a little bit about it, but really the webinar, the value of the webinar is to programs who are running youth initiated mentoring, who are really sharing the like what I've learned and what to do and what not to do. So that's a great resource as well. Oh yeah, I could have included my email address on my slides too. Someone just asked what my email address is. But so I think those are some things. I think also, again, that we have fewer actual materials around this, but I think this piece of, I guess the Pittsburgh Mentoring Partnership, I think already has a lot of materials around kind of everyday mentoring and mentee training in traditional mentoring programs. And I would be thrilled to also support and or work with programs who are really interested in thinking about what would it mean to develop and design some of this network oriented mentor training, because I think that there's some of that happening, but I don't know of it really being very having a lot of materials to share around that piece. I'm also happy to share some of the early versions of some of the materials that we developed for the TRIO program, where we were first starting to develop Connected Scholars. And again, the site that Rebecca shared and that I think Bud will follow up with is the official Connected Scholars site. But right now, some of it geared towards a slightly older population.
Mm-hmm. What about any other things that, and Sarah, this is a place where you may be like, oh, here's some of the things that I wish out of this crowd. So you just mentioned, I was like, yeah, if anyone's interested in kind of partnering in terms of, developing more of like how to train mentors in like supporting this kind of skill development side with students. Are there other things that you're also, other calls to action, either that you think programs could do, or that you're like, oh, if you're interested in this, like email Sarah?
Yeah. No, I think that this piece of kind of transitioning from traditional to, or I guess hybrid models of one-on-one match-based mentoring, and then incorporating either some of the Connected Scholars workshops into a one-on-one mentoring relationship, or as part of closure, really thinking, doing some what we call eco mapping, which is relationship mapping of who are the other people in your life who you can reach out to and can provide different types of support when this relationship comes to a close. Yeah, I think those are probably the pieces where I feel like there's a need for us, with programs to really better understand what the needs are and what best practices are. Um, but and I would say more generally also just ideas, feedback, things that you're thinking, oh, that doesn't make like any sense in in this context, or there's this piece which you didn't speak to at all. Working with, develop a web support. So I would love, again, I realize in retrospect, I'm like, well, let's make this a dialogue, and it's a webinar, so that makes it. But I, again, would love to hear your voices and ideas, to inform both what I'm doing and think about if there are ways to collaborate.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we were both saying. It's like there really needs to be this loop of a conversation. It's like this is what we're learning out of research and trying to get it out into the practice world, but also the practice world kind of saying like here's where I agree, where like you're doing stuff that doesn't make any sense or there's some barriers. So I think there's a lot of people that would love to partner in that kind of way potentially. I know I was very successful. That was one of my things that worked really well for me when I was running nonprofits was having really kind of good, authentic partnerships with researchers to develop programs and all. So I want to respect people's time. We're kind of at the end. So Sarah, first, thank you so much. Particularly it's lunchtime, so probably everyone else is eating while they're engaging in the conversation. But I really appreciate
When I
it.
do have a 1:00 meeting,
Yeah.
I'm like back-to-back Zoomed.
I'm gonna feel free to sign off on your side of it, but thank you again, like so much. There's going to be another webinar where we're talking actually about the Mentor Hub app. That's also this very interesting kind of research informed app as well too. But like I said, I will follow up with an email, and I'll make sure that I interact with Sarah, both in terms of our debriefing this a little bit, but also in terms of sending you guys links to like, here's some things that you can kind of just click on and look at to think about doing as next steps as well too. So thank you for all the questions, and everyone, like enjoy your lunch and all of your next Zoom meetings as well too.
Thank you so much, Bud, and thank you all for being here.